So the Chiefs are taking on the Eagles in Super Bowl 59, and while they are slight favorites heading into this game, I think they probably should be favored by more due to a certain familiarity Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes have with one of their key coaches. I'll talk about why I think this is an underrated advantage for KC, recap the team's last Super Bowl and regular season meetings, and more. But first, how about those? Alright, so we officially move on from the cry asses in Buffalo to Super Bowl 59, roughly a week and a half away from this game being played in New Orleans, and this is obviously a Super Bowl 57 rematch between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles. It was a high-scoring affair, Super Bowl 57, where the Eagles put up 24 points alone in the first half. Hurts got in on the tush-push on the opening drive. Kelce then scored an 18-yard, beautiful 18-yard touchdown from a nicely lofted pass from Mahomes. And with the game tied at 7, Butker sadly missed his 42-yard field goal attempt, bouncing it off the left upright. Billy then flew downfield via a 45-yard pass to A.J. Brown, but thankfully Nick Bolton made a huge play a couple drives later at a very key time. The Eagles were driving and looking to potentially go up 21-7, but Bolton stopped a QB draw, and as Hurts reacted to Bolton being there in his lane, he fumbled, and Bolton scooped it up and took it 36 yards to the house, and that tied the game. Philly was on fire, though, and still scored 10 more points by halftime, making it a 10-point game, with KC trailing 24-14. Well, the second half is where things began to change as the Chiefs then proceeded to outscore the Eagles 24-11. Pacheco had a short touchdown run, and while Philly was able to score a touchdown in the fourth quarter, KC scored 2 touchdowns on similar style plays. Corndog with Sky Moore and Kadarius Toney, of all people, catching those touchdowns. That Sky Moore touchdown was helped mightily by the fact that Kadarius Toney had the longest punt return in Super Bowl history, where he switched sides of the field and went 65 yards up the right sideline. The game was tied at 35 all with 5 minutes left in the game as the Eagles were able to score again, and that's when KC was able to put together a 12-play drive through the 2-minute warning that included the huge Mahomes scramble up the middle of the field for 26 yards. The drive was extended on 3rd and 8. They were already in the red zone, but it got extended when Mahomes targeted Juju, overthrew him. James Bradbury then got flagged for holding, and people still cry about that call to this day. I mean, it's absolutely embarrassing work from one fan base to the next, but it is what it is. What that allowed the Chiefs to do, though, was instead of kicking a field goal with 2 minutes left on that 3rd and 8, it would have been 4th and 8, they were able to get the clock all the way down to 8 seconds and kick the go-ahead field goal, going up 3, and that ultimately put the game out of reach. Mahomes threw 3 touchdown passes in this one, getting sacked 0 times in spite of having a sprained ankle, with Travis Kelce and Juju Smith-Schuster leading the room. Pacheco had 76 yards on the ground, and then again, Kadarius Toney had that incredible punt return and just 1 catch for 5 yards, but that was for a touchdown. What some people forget about this game, though, because the Eagles did end up losing, was how awesome Jalen Hurts was. He threw for over 300 yards in that one deep ball tutty to A.J. Brown, but he also had 15 carries for 70 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns via the tush push. Devontae Smith, A.J. Brown, and Dallas Goedert all had great performances as well, and that's worth noting because all 3 of those guys are still on the team and were the 3 main targets for Hurts this season. A.J. Brown eclipsed 1,000 yards. Devontae Smith wasn't far behind with 833 of his own, and then Goddard had nearly 500. And that's saying something because this year they obviously have one of the best players in the league in Saquon Barkley, who rushed for over 2,000 yards and had 13 rushing touchdowns. He could have had way more, by the way, but the tush push is a thing there in Philly, and so Jalen Hurts actually had 14 rushing touchdowns of his own, which is pretty wild. But more on their current team here later, because before talking about the here and now, I did want to briefly look at the most recent battle between these two teams, which was actually Week 11 of the 2023 NFL season. That was a much lower scoring game than Super Bowl 57, which took place roughly 9 months prior. So 9 months after was this Week 11 match, to be clear. Well, after 2 straight 3-and-outs by both teams, they then had long touchdown drives. Watson snagged KC's first score. Then on the next drive, DeAndre Swift did it on the ground. Hurts and Mahomes both threw interceptions before Kelce snagged a short touchdown pass, and Harrison Butker drilled a 43-yarder before halftime. This was the opposite of the Super Bowl, by the way, where this time the Chiefs were up 10 by half instead of trailing by 10. The second half was more of a defensive showing, or the offense falling short at times, because it featured 8 punts. But in between those punts, Jalen Hurts had a touchdown run, KC got all the way to the Eagles' 14, and Travis Kelce had a very rare and costly fumble. Then Hurts tush-pushed his way in for another score with 6 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. So a couple drives later, KC found themselves still trailing by 4, and they needed a touchdown. Well, that featured the infamous deep shot to MVS, who had separation, was open, could have had a touchdown, but he dropped the pass. That would have had KC up by 3 with just under 2 minutes to go in the game. Well, instead, KC found themselves facing a 4th and 25 a couple plays later and ended up turning the ball over on downs. Eagles won it 21-17. It was a game where both QBs threw for under 200 yards. Each had an interception. Mahomes had a couple TD passes. Meanwhile, Hurts had 2 on the ground, but KC was able to sack him 5 times. Chris Jones and Trent McDuffie each had 2, and then A.J. Brown had just 1 catch for 8 yards. Probably needed to read that book on the sideline a bit more. Meanwhile, Devontae Smith had 6 snags for 99 yards. He'll be one to watch in this one for sure. Justin Watson, Kelce, and Rice led the Chiefs pass catchers through the air, but the story of this game to me came down to 3 crucial plays for the Chiefs. Mahomes threw a pick in the end zone. They were in the red zone. He was targeting, I think, Watson. It got picked off in the end zone. Then Kelce fumbled in the red zone, and finally MVS dropped a would-be touchdown pass. That was the difference of at least 1 to 2 touchdowns and a field goal, and then of course they ended up losing because of that by 4. Well, that's also the game where Nick Sirianni yelled at Chiefs fans after the game, taunting them and yelling, "See ya!" See ya! As he walked into the tunnel like a jackass. Well, obviously karma hit him pretty hard, the entire team, after that game, because they finished out the rest of the season losing 5 of their next 7 and got blown out by the Bucs in the wild card round. Meanwhile, the Chiefs beat the Niners in Super Bowl 58. All right, real quick, I want to shout out a couple ways you can support the channel. You can get some HBTC coffee of Benchwarmer Brew. This has got origin notes of Mexico and Ethiopia, a smooth medium roast, and it is one of the most popular blends of the lineup. Then you can also snag some HBTC merch. We've got Dad Bod Season, X Factor in honor of Dante Hall, mixed with Xavier Worthy, of course, and much more. Links to both the coffee and merch are in the description down below. But just like Super Bowl 57, the 2023 season was the past, and these teams definitely look different now. They have a couple baller rookies on the defensive side of the ball for starters. We'll get to them. But then they also have Saquon Barkley, the signing of all signings, probably for any team in the offseason. He had an MVP-type season, and they have some dogs on both sides of the ball. We already know about Barkley, talked about him, AJ, the book-reading Brown, Devontae Smith, and Goddard, but they have a great offensive and defensive line. Howie Roseman, their GM, has put a clear emphasis on building in the trenches and kind of building around that, and it's worked out very well. Philly was one of 2 NFC teams I've been saying for quite a while at the back half of the regular season that I think probably ends up making it to the Super Bowl. The other was the Lions, but their D-line, or their defense as a whole rather, got decimated. Meanwhile, the Eagles stayed pretty healthy and dominant throughout the stretch. Their O-line and D-line is a big reason why. Jordan Mailata, Landon Dickerson, Cam Jurgens, Lane Johnson are all some of the best at their position, though it's worth noting both Landon Dickerson and Cam Jurgens are a bit banged up at the moment, and they will be 2 key pieces to watch when it comes to the injury report. Cam Jurgens is dealing with the back issue, and then Landon Dickerson, his knee. Now, the Eagles offense was number 6 in points scored this season and finished 2nd in rushing yards per game. That makes sense when you have Hurts, a dual threat quarterback, and Saquon Barkley. Now, their passing offense from a statistical standpoint isn't really anything to write home about, but again, when you have Saquon and Hurts combining for over 2,600 yards and like 27 touchdowns on the ground, you don't need to do all that much in the passing game. I mean, they finished this year first in the NFC East and with a record of 14-3, so they are doing something right, obviously, and one of those losses took place against the Commanders when Hurts left due to a concussion. Meanwhile, he got healthy for the playoff run in which they beat the Packers 22-10, the Rams 28-22, and then scorched the Commanders 55-23. Hurts did bang up his knee in, I believe, the Rams game, and I thought it would affect him in the Commanders game, but he looked fine. They scored 7 rushing touchdowns, and Hurts seemed to be moving well, so I'm not super worried about him being limited in the Super Bowl, especially with 2 weeks of rest. Now, it's worth noting the Rams almost came back in that game, but the defense played a big role in shutting them down end game, particularly the interior of the D-line. Jalen Carter. He was one of the main culprits getting to Stafford on back-to-back plays. The Eagles defense is holding teams to 17.9 points per game, which according to team rankings is the #1 scoring defense in the NFL. Dogs is basically what the Chiefs are going up against. Thankfully, they aren't as scary as maybe the Texans D-line when it comes to pass rushers, sacks, and pressures. They finished bottom of the league in pressures this season, bottom 4 or 5, but part of that is simply because their secondary is pretty fantastic. But before I get to them, Josh Sweat and Nolan Smith Jr. led the team in sacks, but Jalen Carter had 12 tackles for loss, which is impressive. In their 3 playoff games, though, Nolan Smith has had 4 sacks in 3 games, which is pretty impressive. They are great at creating turnovers as well, racking up 26 on the year, and that helped them finish near the top 5 in turnover differential. This is not a team that you can sleepwalk on, well coached, a lot of great players on both sides of the ball. And again, this is helped by the fact that they have 2 incredible cornerbacks in Cooper DeJean and Quinyon Mitchell. A team that stays successful is a team that can draft well and make crucial free agent signings, and Howie Roseman has been able to do just that almost year in and year out. Let's talk about Quinyon Mitchell for a second. He's allowed just 5 catches on 15 targets for 24 yards and has 2 interceptions alone in these 3 playoff games. They also have a couple veterans back there we are well aware of in Darius Slay and CJ Gardner-Johnson. Before I get to the next segment, did you guys know that I have an NFL-wide news channel covering all things NFL outside of the Kansas City Chiefs? It's called Cole Breaks the Huddle, and I do a very poor job of letting you guys know that I run a second channel where we drop multiple videos a week covering big picture NFL news. So if you enjoy my style of content with the editing, the pacing, and all that, but want to hear it from an NFL-wide perspective, this is the channel for you. Link is in the description down below. I do think the Chiefs can win this game. It's going to be a very tough matchup, and I'm going to break down my reasons why in upcoming videos. We have plenty of time for that. But for now, here's a couple things worth noting about Super Bowl 59 in this matchup that takes place in roughly a week and a half. The Chiefs are actually 1.5 point favorites for what that's worth, with Philly wearing their green home jerseys and KC donning the white jerseys, and I hope it's white on white, white jersey, white pants. That's the cleanest combo in my opinion. Something interesting about the white jersey, 16 of the past 20 Super Bowl winners wore white jerseys, with the Chiefs and Eagles being the only teams in the last decade to wear their colored jerseys and win, which is pretty interesting, I guess. On top of that, there's an interesting stat floating around that this will be the 5th time 2 head coaches rematch in a Super Bowl, and out of the previous 4 times this has happened, the coaches that won the original game all won the rematch, going 4-0. Well, that bodes well for KC, though again, I'm not sure how much that one actually means to me, because at the end of the day, you've got to go out and play this game and execute on offense, defense, and special teams to get out with the win. I do think coaching plays a big role, and I do favor Andy Reid and Spags over the coaching staff of the Eagles, which is no disrespect to them, but in the brightest of lights, in the toughest of moments, Andy Reid and Spags have been able to get it done time and time again, and I'm not going to lose faith in them now. Something that might mean a bit more to me, though, is the fact that Mahomes has never lost to the Eagles' defensive coordinator, Vic Fangio. He's actually 8-0 against him, throwing 10 touchdowns and 2 interceptions in those games. Fangio was the head coach of the Broncos from 2019 to 2021, where he lost all 6 of those. And then he lost twice to Kansas City as the defensive coordinator in Miami. I believe that was the Germany game and the wild card round in the very frigid temperatures at Arrowhead. The Eagles' defense is obviously fantastic, but Andy Reid and Mahomes have had a lot of success against Fangio over the years, and I do think that continues here very soon as the Chiefs look to hoist up their 3rd Lombardi trophy in a row. And yeah, maybe this isn't some huge advantage that the Chiefs have per se, because people will argue against the Vic Fangio thing, never beating Patrick Mahomes, and saying, well, when he was with the Broncos and the Dolphins, they had an inferior roster on the defensive side of the ball, but the Eagles' defense this year is great. Well, touche, they have a good roster. I've been giving them praise and props all video long. However, that has never bothered Mahomes before. They beat a great Eagles defense a couple years ago, a great 49ers defense in Super Bowl 54 and Super Bowl 58. So the great defense, that definitely helps Vic Fangio out a bit, but to ignore the fact that Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid are going to be familiar with Fangio's style of defense compared to maybe a coordinator they've never gone up against before or very little, this really does help the Kansas City Chiefs, because yeah, the players can change and be a little bit better, but the scheme and the overall theme that Fangio brings to his defenses is going to be the same, maybe with a little bit of wrinkles. Either way, this is an advantage for the Kansas City Chiefs and should help them in this game. I do want to point out that wide receiver Rashee Rice recently shared a photo of his Super Bowl jersey, and that got fans excited, thinking he's potentially returning for this game, which would obviously be a huge boost for the offense. Unfortunately, I think that's most likely not going to happen. Andy Reid said in a presser a couple weeks ago, out of all the players he mentioned, that the odds of Sky Moore or Rashee Rice returning would be very slim, though I guess they technically could open up Rice's window to return from IR. It's certainly within the realm of possibilities, but for me, I'm putting that as 95% probably not going to happen. I just don't think his knee will be fully rehabbed and game ready until a few months from now, a couple months from now maybe, and that means he will make his return for the 2025 season. But we won't see him back until he serves whatever suspension is coming his way, whatever suspension the NFL ends up serving him for the offseason crash and run situation from last year. Mahomes will have plenty of players to throw to in this one, though, with Worthy coming off of an incredible AFC Championship performance. Kelsey averages 6 catches for 62 yards and almost a touchdown in each matchup against Philly over their last 4, so he's obviously going to be a favorite for Patrick. But then we can't forget about DeAndre Hopkins, even though he's been quiet this postseason. Hollywood Brown is going to be your speedy man coverage beater along with Worthy. And then Juju Smith-Schuster had 2 catches for 60 yards just last week. Then don't sleep on Noah Gray or Justin Watson, who caught the 2-point conversion in the win over Buffalo. It's going to be an awesome game, and I can't wait to break things down further for you all very soon. With that being said, though, let me know your initial thoughts on this game as it stands right now, even though it's a little ways away. And until next time, let's go. Let's freaking go. How about those?